Prime amongst those is our first speaker, because we would be here till mid-afternoon if I gave you his entire CV. So I hope he doesn't see it as a disservice if I give you the grossly expurgated version. He has been for 30 years a leading player in the area of HIV-related clinical research. He recently oversaw Washington University's clinical and translational research response to COVID. He is, to give him his full title, Director of the Institute of Public Health in Washington University in St. Louis, where he is also Associate Dean for Clinical and Translational Science and also Director of the Division of Infectious Diseases. And as I say, that's the grossly expurgated version. You can imagine what the full CV is like. Will you please welcome Professor Bill Powderly. Over to you, Bill.
Good morning, and I'd like to thank you all for being here, but I particularly want to thank Peter Doran and Martin O'Donnell for the invitation to come and speak to you, and particularly talk about what I see as the role of excellence in clinical and translational research as contributing to ultimate benefit for patients and for our communities. So when we think about the translational health journey, we're talking about bringing the research initially into patients to prove a concept, to then do clinical trials to show that it works, demonstrate the efficacy of that new treatment, that new device, that new diagnostic. And then we want to bring it into the healthcare community in general. And finally, if we're good at it and able to do it, we actually want to bring it into the population to improve the health of our communities. And that's a critical and important part of this translational journey. And this translational journey can take quite some time. But I wanted to just put it in place by saying there are many players involved in this. Discovery is often at the level of the academia, at the level of the university, as you heard this morning. Industry plays a major role in taking those initial discoveries and bringing them to the point where they can be tested in man, and you go back then into the clinical and academic community. But you also need hospitals and healthcare systems to be part of this to create ultimately an effective academic health network or center that can deliver the promise of translational research. It would be remiss of me not to start, however, the discussion on the role of clinical and translational research without first mentioning the critical importance of basic science. The fundamental process of discovery, and Peter touched on this in his remarks this morning, but you can't translate anything, you can't bring anything into patients and ultimately into testing unless you have that innovation and discovery. And it is not the case that all fundamental discovery has happened and that all we need to do now are clinical trials, but we need to continue to both invest in as communities and deliver to the clinical community the new technologies that will be tested as we move forward. One of the things that was identified many years ago was a translation gap. The NIH spending a lot of money, this is an old slide, but the NIH spending a lot of money on basic science. The biotech and pharma industry spending a huge amount of money on clinical trial development, but this gap between the investment in discovery and the delivery of the outcomes of that discovery. And that is a critically important part in thinking through how we shorten that gap. And one of the things that the National Institutes of Health in the United States about 20 years ago, recognizing that the importance of that gap, started to invest in infrastructure across the United States, created a new center in the National Institute, the National Center for Advancing Translation, or NCATS, and funds a large amount of infrastructure across approximately 60 university medical centers across the United States, with an annual investment of about $700 million. And that really has accelerated the phase of research to translation, but hasn't completely closed the gap, and I'll return to that in a moment. When we think of clinical trials, those of us who talk about the phases of translation talk about this as the domain of T2 research. The classic point where you take initial discovery from the bedside into clinical care. And there are three phases. The first is to get enough information that will justify a larger human study. The second are the studies that will show that whatever intervention you're talking about does have some efficacy and can be justified for a larger trial, and then a larger trial itself. And when many people, and particularly the public, think about clinical trials, they're thinking about this third phase, to get sufficient efficacy and safety data for regulatory approval. And they're classically randomized, controlled, usually multi-center, double-blind, and even multinational studies. And that's a critically important role, but it's equally important for a center that is ambitious to be able to take on discovery and bring it into patients, to have the capability and capacity to do phase 1 and phase 2 trials. So one of the institutes that I direct at Washington University is our Institute for Clinical and Translational Sciences. And like all CTSAs, this is part of a network funded by the National Center for Advancing Translational Science that provides a research infrastructure and a training environment for clinical research. Our mission is to improve health outcomes and the well-being of our communities. Our mission is not to develop new drugs and new technologies. It is to bring those advances into the healthcare environment so that the lives of people can be improved. It's disease agnostic. So we will provide an infrastructure, and we provide an infrastructure to enhance clinical translational collaboration. And we build the research capacity and training and career paths for clinical investigators, but not just for the clinical investigators, but for the entire research team. Because one of the classic things that I think is increasingly recognized is that research is a team science. You can have your star center forward, but if you don't have a team backing up that person, you will not have successful research. And so we invest in education, communication, collaborations, and support, providing research support, the research nursing, the recruitment tools to enhance recruitment into clinical research. And this is a very significant investment. This investment at our institution is approximately $11 million a year. It's backed by a $7 million a year NIH grant and $4 million of institutional investment coming from both our university and from our hospital. I want to just emphasize a couple of things in thinking about this as you create an environment of excellence. The first thing is that training is essential. Medical schools produce, hopefully, great doctors. At the very least, they produce good doctors. Universities produce great scientists. Being a good doctor, being a good scientist, doesn't mean you're an effective clinical trialist. Not enough investigators have had formal training or any type of training in protocol development or real-world implementation in clinical research. And that's a critical and crucial gap. There's often a fallacy in medicine that knowledge, expertise in a disease state, being a good cardiologist, being a good endocrinologist, can make you a good clinical trialist. And that simply is not true. The second thing is to recognize that having a robust clinical research program improves patient outcome. There is a strong, probably causal relationship between participating in clinical research in hospitals and the outcome for patients whose disease is under study. And not just for the patients who are on the clinical trials and in the clinical research program, but for all patients. The outcomes for all patients in that institution that participates in clinical research in an effective manner improves the outcome for everybody. Institutions that are active in clinical trials are more likely to take up innovations and more likely to see better patient outcomes. The vast majority of data comes from cancer research, but it has also been shown in cardiology and HIV trials. Now, I talked about the gap, the initial gap between preclinical research and clinical research, and the need to accelerate that gap. But increasingly over the last 10 years, we've identified that there's a second gap. A gap between doing clinical trials, identifying patients who benefit from those trials, but I think then translating that into the healthcare environment in general. One of the things about clinical research as we do more and more sophisticated trials is we stratify patients by many technologies, whether it's metabolomics, imaging, whether it's based on certain exclusion and inclusion criteria in trials. But most of the patients that are treated in our hospitals don't fit the clinical trial. So we need a way, and we need a way of thinking about how to validate our research and bring that into the clinical environment. And that's a critical and crucial role of any clinical research institute, is thinking not only about the trial itself, but how you're going to use the information from the trial to improve health. We have evidence-based interventions. And it's critically important that those of us who are interested in the clinical and translational research environment can move those evidence-based interventions. One of the most surprising things that if you talk to clinicians or trialists is the gap that occurs between the evidence coming from a clinical trial and even being accepted as guidelines by professional societies, and that becoming standard of care in medical practice. And the gap is huge. It's 10 to 15 years. And therefore, the benefit of what you will be doing in a clinical trial will not be seen in your patients unless you identify that gap and work on ways that will close that gap through a lens of translation, of dissemination and implementation science. It would appear as if my graphics for this particular slide have not translated well. But I wanted to just mention the critical importance of community engagement and community partnership in clinical research. We do research for our patients. Historically, one of the gaps that has existed is that clinical investigators do trials, and industry does trials that actually don't really address the problems that the patients themselves are facing. Nor do we think about the opportunities to educate our patients with us so that we can increase the level of trust and the level of knowledge in our patient communities and have this bidirectional exchange. As an anecdote, many people have, over the last number of years, have come to see Tony Fauci as a hero in the response to COVID. But in his early days as director of the National Institutes of Allergy and Infectious Diseases in the United States, he oversaw the response to HIV and AIDS. And one of the first things he did was he brought patients into the dialogue about what trials should be designed. And he was the first investigator, and as a young investigator at that time, what he did had a major influence in the way I thought about clinical trials. And that is that we need to make them relevant to the patients that we want to engage with us and join those clinical trials. So it's critically important, as you think about developing excellence, that you develop an engagement strategy with the community. You have a community advisory board. You think through what your community will benefit from the clinical trials initiative. So as was mentioned, I've spent most of my academic career as an HIV researcher. And I learned, this is a slide I put together about 4 or 5 years ago, lessons from HIV/AIDS research. The first is that investment in basic science is crucial. All of the advances that we've seen in a disease such as HIV came from an investment in basic research. When I started out as a clinical and researcher in HIV, all of my patients died. That's an incredible challenge for a young doctor, that all your patients die. And we now have a disease that is completely controllable, that if patients start on therapy, take their medicine, they will have a normal life expectancy. And that has happened, for that to have happened during the course of a single investigator's career is remarkable. But it comes from an investment in basic science and then having an organized clinical research endeavor to bring the fruits of that basic science into the patient population. Community engagement, working with the community, was crucial in making that. HIV is a disease that often affects marginalized, stigmatized communities. So for them to have trust in the establishment, this trust in academia and in the medical establishment is critically important. We recognize the increasing role of T3, T4 research, that is implementation, bringing the fruits of our clinical trials into the community. In fact, currently, worldwide, and certainly in the United States, the major gap in being able to completely control HIV is that certain communities remain marginalized and don't have the access to therapy that others do. And as a scientist, you're always careful to say this. You can never imagine the complete future, and new problems will always emerge. And for those of us in infectious diseases, slides don't want to show me the next slide. There we go. For those of us in infectious diseases, the new problem became a pandemic. And the pandemic of SARS-CoV-2 and COVID challenged the entire infrastructure and medical, the way we deliver healthcare, but also challenged the way we do research. And as I mentioned, the National Institutes of Health, through the NCATS program, funds a large number of centers across the United States. And so we had to pivot our clinical research endeavors to meet a new disease, a disease about which we knew nothing, and we were learning as we went along. But we were able to address the challenge to the biomedical research enterprise and think about how we would use the infrastructure we had and what were the needs. One of the things, and this is an article published by Janet Woodcock, who was then the acting director of the Food and Drug Administration, the FDA in the United States. It was published in Nature Drug Discovery about a year and a half into the epidemic. And in the United States, all clinical trials are registered. They have to be registered before patients can be enrolled in a national database. They examined the national database, and they found that of the nearly 3,000 trials for COVID that were registered, only 5% were adequately powered and randomized. That represented 26% of a planned enrollment of over 500,000 patients. Now, this is not to impugn the undoubted response of many investigators at clinical sites who thought they needed to do a study in a disease for which we had no knowledge and no prior knowledge. But the reality is that had all these patients been enrolled in those clinical trials, we would have gotten very little useful information. And I'll come back to that in a moment. So what did we learn from COVID? We learned, first of all, that we needed to increase engagement. One of the challenges in the United States, and I suspect it's a challenge elsewhere, was that many of our disadvantaged patients, particularly those and ethnic minorities, received their care at hospitals that weren't academic medical centers. And therefore, their ability to participate in innovative clinical trials was much more limited. So we needed to expand participation of our clinical trials to non-academic sites and to create an infrastructure where we could create a culture of clinical acceptance of clinical trials, both at the hospitals and in the community, and expand the ability to do so. And that was a national need. And I was encouraged to hear the plans to roll out clinical trials across the CELTA network this morning. We need to increase expertise. We need to have more people who understand how to do clinical trials. Even if it's not their practice from a day-to-day perspective, if an emergency comes along, at least they know how a clinical trial is done, they know what it takes, and they can participate in a clinical trial that you're trying to expand rapidly. We need to embrace technology, but also bridge the technical divide. And there are clear technical opportunities in enrollment and data collection. And I want to just give you a quick example. We had a group of investigators in our psychiatry department who in March of 2020, just at the beginning of the epidemic, came to me with a hypothesis, fluvoxamine, which is an antidepressant that was licensed and approved, and therefore there was a strong safety profile, had in animal models evidence of suppressing cytokine storm, which was regarded as possibly one of the mechanisms by which patients with COVID actually were being hospitalized and dying. So they proposed a study. We got the study both FDA approved and designed and reviewed by RIB in 9 days. And we started the study, and it was entirely remote. The investigators never met a single patient in this trial. Because you remember COVID in the early days, you couldn't bring people to the hospital if they had early symptoms. You had nowhere to look after them. We didn't know as much as we know about the transmission dynamics. So everything was remote. Everything was done using a telehealth approach, seeing the patient face-to-face, home delivery of the drug or placebo, monitoring by either computer or phone. The patients filled out a self-report, and then on a telehealth visit with a nurse, it was completed. Used an informatics-driven way of identifying patients with symptoms and local advertising, fully enrolled the trial in a little over 3 months, with evidence in this early study of an effect on hospitalizations, leading to a JAMA publication in November. And ultimately several large NIH-funded randomized clinical trials that subsequently showed that the drug, while effective, did not reduce hospitalizations or decrease mortality. But nonetheless, as a concept, in showing how you can use innovation, take the notion of disruption caused by COVID and actually use it to accelerate innovation in clinical trial delivery. This is a tremendous advance. The use of telehealth is a tremendous advance in this regard. But we also have to understand that this may, if we don't proactively think about this, it has issues around access and equity. Because people need, if you're going to use telehealth, people need access to broadband. They need to actually be able to get on the internet. And that is an issue in rural communities, certainly in the United States. And it's also an issue of equity in terms of poverty. If you can't afford a cell phone, then you're not going to be able to participate in this trial. The other thing we recognized is that we need to expand the efficiency of clinical trials. So the recovery process in the UK and the active process in the United States showed us that you can do master trials studying multiple drugs on the same platform. We recognize that small, underpowered studies are unethical. So I showed you that slide about all of those trials that were underpowered and couldn't give an answer. It is unethical to enroll a patient in a trial that cannot give an answer, because you're suggesting to the patient that you will learn something from that experiment, but you won't. So that has to be understood. And then we recognized we needed to simplify the review and contracting process. It was done very rapidly in an emergency situation, but it needs to become routine. And then increase dissemination and implementation. So, I have a few concluding remarks. In 2021, the United States spent $45 billion on biomedical research. Just like the research funds that Irish universities get from the EU or from the HRB or SFI, etc., it's taxpayer money. And so we have a responsibility as an academic community to give a return on that investment. So one of the things we've been doing is looking at this way of how do you describe that investment, demonstrating the impact of science to the broader community. And it has become critical in the post-COVID years that we do this and do this effectively as skepticism in science increases. Academics historically count widgets, grants and publications, and we all get promoted on the basis of grants and publications. But the people who pay for our research don't really care about our grants and publications. They care about improving health, saving lives, and saving money. So we need to work out a mechanism that will assess that impact so we can tell our story properly to people. And so we have created a translation science benefit model that talks about clinical benefits, community benefits, economic benefits, and policy benefits, and actually provides a toolbox for investigators or for institutes to actually use that mechanism in order to better tell their story to their funders, to their patients, to their communities. So finally, why do we do this? If you're in an academic health center that's working, you're creating a virtuous cycle. You're delivering high-quality clinical care. You're training students and the workforce. But from that, you're learning. You create a learning health system, a system that tells you what the problems are, and in that you embed clinical trials. And ultimately, you can have a big outcome for the big problems that affect our communities. And that's the virtuous cycle of academia. Thanks very much.
Thank you.